Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Nation So Conceived, Abraham Lincoln and the Paradox of Democratic Sovereignty, by Michael P. Zuckert, narrated by David Colacci. Forward. In The Catcher in the Rye, Holden Caulfield says that what really knocks him out is a book that, when you're all done reading it, you wish the author that wrote it was a terrific friend of yours, and you could call him up on the phone whenever you felt like it. I anticipate that many owners of this fine book will wish that Michael Zuckert was their friend, and that they could immediately call him up and discuss its challenging thoughts. It is a book that invites underlining and marginal comments, and most importantly, collective discussion, whether with the author or, more likely, in seminars or even book clubs, inasmuch as it is written in fully accessible prose. I cannot think of a book more appropriate for the University Press of Kansas series on constitutional thinking, which I have the privilege of co-editing with Jeff Toulis, Emily Zachin, and Mariah Zeisberg. Thinking is no easy task, especially when it concerns not only one of the central figures in the American pantheon, Abraham Lincoln, but also the single most important event following the founding period of the late 18th century. As a president, Lincoln almost always wins the contest as our most important chief executive. Just as importantly, perhaps, is that he is viewed by many as a source of apparently never-ending insights, not only about the particularities of the mid-19th century, but also, presumably, about our own political conditions. The Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. serves as the central temple of American civil religion. Washington may have the city's name and the tallest monument, but it's the Lincoln Memorial that has now become the venue for many of our most important moments as a political order and the evocation of what he so memorably called the mystic chords of memory. This is probably most evidenced by Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech in 1963, but each listener can easily summon up other examples. As for the Civil War, it was the occasion for the death of more than 2% of the entire population, the equivalent today of approximately 7.5 million deaths. It also, and at least as importantly, shaped American politics over the ensuing 16 decades. William Faulkner's famous line, "The past is never dead, it's not even past," applies to far more than the white Southerners about whom he was specifically writing. Might it have been avoided? Just as important, should it have been avoided, if avoidance could happen only via continued compromises with what was rightly called the slavocracy. Zuckert provides invaluable guidance in understanding both Lincoln and the politics of the United States between 1845 and Lincoln's death in 1865. He does so by focusing on roughly a dozen speeches that Lincoln made in the course of his career, beginning in 1838 and ending with his so-called last speech, which Lincoln obviously did not offer as such, on April 11, 1865, presented in chronological order. This is not only a reader-friendly organization. It is motivated also by Zuckert's emphasis on Lincoln as a practical politician, who was always fully aware of the political context of the moment within which he was speaking. It may be that one can draw some general lessons from Lincoln and his career, but that is not because he was, for example, a political visionary indifferent to how his ideas would be immediately received and content to be viewed as a prophet without honor in his own time. Instead, along with whatever lessons one might in fact draw from Lincoln's specific views and arguments, such as those on the basic immorality of slavery, one also inevitably learns about how an ambitious, even brilliant politician shapes arguments by reference to perceived political realities. It is perhaps unfortunate that Zuckert does in fact provide insights into our politics today, when serious voices suggest that we may be on the brink of a renewed civil war, and much in need of the kind of enlightened leadership that Lincoln is thought to have provided. But what exactly accounts for Lincoln's towering stature, and what lessons is he supposed to teach? In fact, Lincoln is a remarkably elusive figure, in terms of trying both to get a firm fix of his persona and, at least as significantly, to establish his precise views on the issues that he was forced to deal with. There was, of course, the overarching issue of slavery, for which it is quite easy to demonstrate that he was truly against it, without reservation. But that only generates additional conversations. What would it take the United States to rid itself of this immoral practice? Lincoln always took great care to distance himself from abolitionists, as Zuckert demonstrates. His political hero was Henry Clay, not Henry David Thoreau. If he was adamantly against slavery, then he was equally adamantly pro-Union, which meant, among other things, supporting the compromises brokered by his hero in 1820 and 1850, the latter of which was certainly denounced by most abolitionists, inasmuch as, among other things, it involved strengthening an already despicable fugitive slave law. Yet he refused to compromise on the issue of extending slavery into American territories that were not yet states. And the war came, as Lincoln famously said in his second inaugural, the subject of Zuckert's penultimate chapter. But, of course, that simply set the stage for what Reconstruction might involve. Zuckert offers a reading of the second inaugural, with its famous call for malice toward none and charity for all, as suggesting that Lincoln, had he lived, might well have supported a mild Reconstruction. Is this meant to contrast with the one we got because radical Republicans in Congress were able to exercise power against the feckless Andrew Johnson? But, of course, this may depend on what one means by mild. Perhaps mildness would counsel a generous policy of pardons and the reintegration of those deemed during the war to be traitors who had committed treason. Quite different, though, would be a mildness that permitted a compromised submission to the defeated white Southerners' desires to maintain with minimal changes the structures of white supremacy and black subordination that underlay the slavery regime. One is quite confident that Zuckert would oppose the latter, which might entail, among other things, only the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, which Johnson fully supported, and not the 14th and 15th Amendments, which he did not. One may well hope that Lincoln would have found Johnson far too mild, but of course we cannot know with confidence, and that is the point. One can debate what kind of Reconstruction Lincoln might have preferred when reflecting in his own study. But, as already emphasized, one must also understand Lincoln as Zuckert does, that is, as a calculating politician, always concerned with not getting so far ahead of the people as to risk repudiation. For Zuckert it is, correctly, not a term of opprobrium to describe Lincoln as a calculating politician. He might well find himself agreeing with Max Weber in this respect, one of whose most famous essays, Politics as a Vocation, emphasized the necessity for any and all politicians to subordinate their devotion to what he called ultimate ends, or what some political theorists term ideal political theory, to the demands posed by actual circumstances. This does not mean that one scraps the ideals, only that one puts them in their place, as it were, as one tries to navigate the shoals of politics. Zuckert is rightly regarded as a leading Straussian within the field of American political thought. It would take us too far afield to consider exactly what that term perhaps means, especially because, as a non-Straussian, I may not be the most reliable guide. Suffice it to say that it features a willingness to read discrete texts with great care and a devotion to extracting from their sometimes elusive messages lessons of deep import to those looking for insight into the nature of political reality over time. If Lincoln is in fact our greatest president, at least in part because of his substantive achievements, then almost by definition he was a great statesman with lessons to teach all of us today about achieving great things while enacting the role of political leader and not mere visionary. Zuckert clearly does believe that Lincoln is someone from whom we have much to learn now and presumably into the foreseeable future. Zuckert describes his chief and primary aim in the book as presenting the central theme that gives Lincoln's thought the remarkable coherence and stability it has, the notion of democratic sovereignty, especially as founded in the Declaration of Independence. But he clearly recognizes, and makes very clear to the listener, the existence of what he refers to as the paradoxes often found in Lincoln's presentations. Some of these may come from the very complexity of the ideas and concepts that Lincoln was wrestling with, including the meaning of such fundamental and contested notions as equality, liberty, or freedom, not to mention the idea of democratic sovereignty itself. Most obviously, can the demos decide without any limits at all on its choices, or is its sovereignty limited by, say, a respect for natural rights or natural law? But it is also possible to identify tensions in his thought derived from the complicated political realities within which he was operating. He could, for example, have scarcely come so close as he did in defeating Stephen A. Douglas for the Illinois Senate seat in 1858, had he agreed with Douglas that he, Lincoln, was not only anti-slavery, but also pro-racial equality, in the sense of allowing black suffrage, or hoping for the repeal of laws prohibiting interracial marriage. So, perhaps not surprisingly, Lincoln's eloquence on the horrors of slavery was almost completely absent when it came to the quotidian discrimination that free black people suffered in Illinois and throughout the country. Similarly, his success in putting together a Republican coalition, many of whose members might well have preferred New York's William Seward, required in part persuading Seward's supporters that his evocations of a higher law that might be used to challenge the Constitution itself was just too dangerous politically in terms of gaining the needed support from Midwestern voters. Lincoln had to thread the needle on slavery and racial discrimination in a way that would allow him to gain an electoral vote victory, with 39.8% of the popular vote, against three opponents whose very presence signified the inability of Democrats, or anti-Republicans, effectively to coalesce to meet the challenge presented by the new party. And, of course, the platform of that party, which involved no further extension of slavery into American territories, had in effect been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in Dred Scott. So much of the middle portion of the book is necessarily devoted to the ever-present issue of how much deference is owed a Supreme Court whose members one might disdain and whose decisions one believes to be disastrous, as well as, of course, misreadings of the Constitution. This issue is scarcely absent from our own politics today. Every chapter of this book has its own importance and generates the desire to ring Zuckert up and begin further conversation. So let me conclude with my own takeaway from two chapters late in the book, one on the Gettysburg Address and the other on the second inaugural address. Zuckert refers to Lincoln as the poet more than the philosopher of the American promise, and he concludes the paragraph by naming him America's greatest poet. I cannot help but be reminded of New York Governor Mario Cuomo, who famously said that politicians campaign in poetry but then are forced to govern in prose. Zuckert offers careful and illuminating analyses of the poetry of these two great speeches. Not at all coincidentally, a visitor to the Lincoln Memorial can find them engraved in stone on its walls. They hold a truly canonical place in the American imagination. So much could be said about almost every sentence of these two poems. I have already adverted to the complexity contained in the call for malice toward none and charity for all. but consider as well what exactly the new birth of freedom announced at Gettysburg might mean. How, if at all, was that term to be translated into the more mundane prose of actual policy? One of Eric Foner's many books on the era is titled Nothing But Freedom, a reference to a comment by former Confederate General Robert Richardson. The emancipated slaves own nothing, because nothing but freedom has been given to them. That is, they were not given the fabled 40 acres and a mule that Thaddeus Stevens might have given had he been in charge of Reconstruction. Zuckert, like Lincoln, is in some sense besotted by the Declaration of Independence and its promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as belonging to all Americans without reservation. But, of course, the central question, both then and now, is what liberty entails, especially with regard to the resources needed, in fact, to pursue one's own vision of happiness and to flourish in life. Similarly, does the great call for government by the people, as well as for the people, entail that the former slaves should get the right to vote? Quite obviously, women did not have that right, a fact that Lincoln never commented on, so one should not presume that the answer would be automatically different with regard to those who had been slaves or even free black people outside the South. In his own book on Lincoln's last speech, the historian Louis Meijer quotes Indiana Radical Republican Senator George Julian as, privately, proclaiming that Lincoln's assassination might have been a gift presented by a providential God who presumably supported the radicals. Had Lincoln lived, he would have had to give concrete meaning to the notion, and limits, of a mild Reconstruction. Would Lincoln have necessarily supported serious efforts at genuine regime change that required far more than the legal demise of the institution of chattel slavery? Perhaps. We can only analyze both Lincoln's character and his speeches in order to discern potential answers. As noted, Zuckert plays close and valuable attention to the thought of the little giant, Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas, particularly with regard to his notions of popular sovereignty, and its all-important differences from Lincoln's own notions of the sovereignty endorsed by the Declaration. But missing from the book is Frederick Douglass, another extraordinarily important orator of 19th-century America. Among other accomplishments is the fact that Douglass might well be the only American who could claim to be a friend of both John Brown, who died as a martyr to the anti-slavery cause, and Abraham Lincoln, who disdained Brown as a law-defying fanatic eager to bring down the house divided. That being said, Zuckert brilliantly analyzes the implications of the house divided metaphor in a way that allows us to wonder about Lincoln's deepest desires and motives, not to mention the fact that he notes as well that Lincoln overrode the advice of some of his closest associates when he decided to deliver it. In his great speech dedicating an 1876 monument to Lincoln, Douglas, after acknowledging Lincoln's greatness, goes on to say, "Truth compels me to admit, even here in the presence of the monument we have erected to his memory, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model. In his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. He was preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men." What Zuckert leads one fully to realize is that being anti-slavery, which Lincoln definitely was, did not necessarily translate in supporting the kinds of policies that would result in the genuine inclusion of enslaved people and free black people in the American political community. A long-time supporter, like his hero Henry Clay, of colonization of black Americans away from the United States, Lincoln was expressing well into his presidency his deep doubts over whether black and white people could truly live together as co-citizens and neighbors. One result of his assassination, of course, is that we are left free to speculate and to argue about what the Lincoln of 1866 might have been like, given that Zuckert portrays so well the extent to which he was always something of an enigma in terms of the prosaic actualities of policy. So one message of this book simply lies in the lessons that might be taught from a careful encounter with the thought and political actions of our most important president. I confess that another, though, is the underscoring of the world we have lost since the mid-19th century. After all, the speeches by Lincoln, Douglas, and Douglas often went on for 2 or 3 hours, and there were audiences who were clearly willing to spend their time listening and then presumably thinking about what they had heard. And all of these speakers wrote their own speeches. We can reasonably speak about Lincoln's views of the Constitution, whether we agree with them or not, because there is no doubt at all that he thought them through and carefully wrote them out before delivering them in front of large audiences. Barack Obama was, of course, president of the Harvard Law Review and a professor at the University of Chicago Law School prior to his becoming president. Bill Clinton graduated from Yale and taught constitutional law at the University of Arkansas. Yet neither ever delivered a full-scale speech that said anything at all significant about the Constitution of the United States, its strengths or its weaknesses. Professor Rogers Smith has suggested that Obama wrote interestingly about the Constitution in his book, The Politics of Audacity. But one of Zuckert's points is that oratory was truly important as a way of educating all American citizens, and not only that relatively small portion that might buy books, either then or now. Both Clinton and Obama are unusually gifted orators, but it would truly be inexplicable if some future author decided to write the kind of book that Michael Zuckert has written so well about the formally uneducated Midwesterner who so remarkably became president, and chose to go to war first to save the Union, and then, perhaps even more importantly, to abolish slavery. There will, no doubt, continue to be many books published on Abraham Lincoln, but I am confident that this book will be one of the rare ones on the overcrowded shelves devoted to Lincoln that will deserve to be read years from now for its illumination of how politics are conducted, for better and for worse, in a fractious country that is always divided against itself in one or another important respect. Sanford Levinson, co-editor, Constitutional Thinking. Introduction. Much has been written on Abraham Lincoln's political thought, but it has seldom been noted how his thought is directed to one abiding question. In 1838, when he was not even 30 years old, he gave a speech directed to the question of the perpetuation of our political institutions. Although the country seemed to be flourishing, he saw reason to fear that American free institutions were in danger of not enduring. Some 25 years later, under very different circumstances, he raised, or rather he claimed that the Civil War in which the nation was then engaged raised, the question whether this nation can long endure. It is this book's claim that this question haunted Lincoln through the entire course of his political career. The question of the nation's endurance or perpetuation persisted in Lincoln's mind because, as he said at Gettysburg, the fall of the regime was a possibility inherent in this nation or any nation, conceived and dedicated as this nation was. The nation, we recall, was dedicated to a proposition that all men are created equal. The problem of perpetuation loomed so large for Lincoln because he considered that proposition, properly adumbrated, to capture the true foundation of political right, but at the same time to be the source of various threats to the survival of the regime. My book is devoted to exploring that paradoxical duality of created equal, to reveal how Lincoln understood both its truth and its potentially pathological consequences, and perhaps most importantly, how his deeds as a political actor constituted a therapy aimed at those particular pathologies. Viewing Lincoln's political action in light of the truth and dangers of this core doctrine of political right leads to some surprising insights into his actions as a statesman. An attempt to bring together Lincoln's political thought, holistically understood, and his political action in relation to his thought, is the chief contribution of this book. Lincoln's first musings on the abiding problem of the nation's persistence occurred in his first noteworthy address on the perpetuation of our political institutions. That is where we begin. 1. The Perpetuation Address. The Tragedy of America. No speech by Lincoln has proved more controversial than the one he delivered to the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield in 1838, when he was not quite 29 years old. It was apparently not much noticed by historians until Edmund Wilson, in his Patriotic Gore of 1962, saw it as a remarkably prescient presentation by Lincoln of the challenges the nation and he himself would face about 2 decades later. After Wilson, readers of Lincoln paid more attention to this speech, but they have been quite mixed in their assessments of its quality and meaning. Some see it as nothing more than a political potboiler, a stylized appeal to Whig stereotypes of Andrew Jackson as a potential Caesar, a threat to the survival of the Republic, and of the masses who supported him as little more than lawless mobs. But the facts Wilson pointed to, the way the speech did seem to anticipate Lincoln's future, have led many others to forego the easy political explanation. Even those who take the speech more seriously and as more personally related to Lincoln offer many ways of reading it. Lincoln's biographer David Donald sees its vacillation between an appeal to cold reason and its warnings of the force and dangers of hot passions as a projection of Lincoln's still unformed, contradictory personality. Other, more daring psychological interpretations abound. It is not difficult for many to find Freudian themes in the speech. Lincoln as Oedipus, both revering the fathers and yet attempting to overcome them, even kill them, by predicting or participating in the subversion of their greatest work, the American Republic. Following a hint in Wilson, the Freudian readers tend to identify Lincoln with the men of towering genius and ambition who belong to the family of the lion or the tribe of the eagle. These psychologists see the address as a projection of Lincoln's psychic state. Others see the speech less as a projection of Lincoln's inner state and more as a statement of his political thought. The leading such study is still Harry Jaffe's 1958 volume, Crisis of the House Divided, but there are many others, including the recent studies by John Channing Briggs and David Lowenthal. All of these authors think the speech tells us something important about Lincoln's political philosophy and his rhetoric, and provides a key to understanding his statesmanship. Unfortunately, they do not agree on just what the speech tells us. I believe there is a common shortcoming in all these smart interpretations so far put forward. No one has taken sufficient notice of the very strange structure of the speech, nor of the paradoxical results of taking that structure seriously. The speech has 3 parts: an introductory section, comprising paragraphs 1 and 2, a second section, comprising paragraphs 3 through 15, on the topic, "How shall we perform our task of perpetuating what has been passed on to us?" and a third section, paragraphs 16 through 24, on the topic, "Why suppose danger to our political institutions?" paragraph 16. The second section concludes with an answer to the question of what we should do. Cultivate a political religion of reverence for the laws, paragraphs 12 through 15, and the third section culminates with the assertion, "Reason, cold, calculated, unimpassioned reason, must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?